his poor ones. So there's a double, there's a coin there, and they have two sides. On the one side of the coin, it is the last days, just before the coming of the Lord, and the flip side of the coin is it's also the last days, which means the nearness of his judgment reserved for those who oppose him is also coming very quickly. So we have the condemnation on the rich, judgment is coming, and then you have the reasons for the coming judgment. They selfishly hoarded their wealth. Now, these are the charges specifically against them, and that's verses 4 through 6. He says, "Behold, the pay of the laborers who mowed your fields, and which has been withheld by you, cries out against you, and the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived luxuriously on the earth and led a life of wanton pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and put to death the righteous man. He does not resist you." So you see the specific charges very clearly right there. Verse 4, he says that you have not paid your people as you should. Verse 5, you have lived luxuriously. You have fattened your own hearts. And in verse 6, you've condemned and put to death the righteous man. There's the specific charges against them. So these reasons for the coming judgment are now going to be detailed. And the tone of accusation that we saw in verses 1, 2, and 3 only increases, and it increases by the specific designations or the descriptions of why judgment is coming upon them. First, they fleeced and they defrauded their workers. Verse 4, they also followed a self-indulgent lifestyle. Verse 5, and they mistreated the righteous. Verse 6. Those are the charges. So let's look at each one of these and see what James says, and we'll make some comments. First, he says in verse 4 that you have defrauded your workers. He says, "Behold," there. And "behold" is another attention getter. It's a phrase that helps to orient his readers to James, the speaker here. It's calling attention to one source. It's almost as like he's snapping his fingers, and when you snap your fingers, everybody looked up. There's the effect. Behold, everybody looks up. That's what it was intended to do, was get everybody's attention. Two specific accusations are given within this one right here. And we need to remember, of course, that agriculture was a way of life, and labor was always needed in agricultural terms. In the area where I lived and grew up in, there were sharecroppers. There were a lot of sharecroppers. Years and years ago, there were a lot of people that lived up and down the road, up and down Kilburn Highway, for example, who worked in the fields. But when mechanization began to catch up with Louisiana, when it began to catch up, you began to see the disappearance of those workers because you had a machine that could do what 10 workers could do in half the time. And so people began to disappear, and they'd have to go find jobs elsewhere. But this is not like that. This is ancient agricultural life here. Labor was always needed. You couldn't do anything without labor. You couldn't, you can pick a field. You can pick maybe an acre in a week or half a week or so. But if you have 10, 15, 20 acres, you'll work yourself to death. So you have to have labor. Labor is always needed. Evidently, the injustices described here have been taking place for a while, though how long is impossible to determine when James writes. He says here, there has this term here, has been withheld, and has reached, are perfect verbs. And what that means is it indicates a past action with ongoing effects. Something that's happened in the past, and the effects of that continue to go on. You began withholding their pay from them at this point, and you're continuing to do it. So this is not something that's just crept up for the first time in their life. That's the effect of those verbs there. Has been withheld and has reached. The first accusation is the pay, and it says the pay cries out. You see that in verse 4. Behold, the pay of the laborers who mowed your fields and which has been withheld by you cries out. So pay is the noun, and cries out is the main verb there. And then there are two participles. You can see that those participles, one of them is who mowed, and the other participle is has been withheld. And these participles here take place before the main verb cries out. So they have mowed your fields, and you have withheld their pay, so therefore they have cried out. They cried out to the Lord. So the sequence there is we're not looking at workers here who are just complaining. We're not talking about workers here who are lazy and this is there for some work supply place or something like that where the guys sign up for one day and then they set for half that day. I've worked with those too. It's not like that at all. These are evidently, they're good workers. After they have mowed the fields, they had not been paid, and so they're crying out. So these are workers that are not just complainers here. The laborers had done their work, but payment has not been made to them. This, by the way, is an Old Testament principle. This was a big no-no in the Old Testament. In Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 13, it's very clear that Israel was not to allow this to happen. God knew that people needed, on a daily basis in this culture, people needed the money. You could not withhold money. They needed that money to go to the market perhaps in the evening or early the next morning and buy food for that day. So Leviticus 19 and verse 13, in the law, it says, "You shall not oppress your neighbor nor rob him. The wages of a hired man are not to remain with you all night until morning." So at the end of the day, go buy a little table, a little tent, and you get your day's wages. Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verses 14 and 15 state the same thing as well. But here you have the verb here, cries out. And cries out here pictures the money unjustly withheld as continually crying out for vengeance. That's the picture here, that the money is crying out because it's not where it's supposed to be. An issue to resolve here, and you can put the PowerPoint up at this point. In James, every once in a while, there's a big issue to resolve. And an issue to resolve here is whether the prepositional phrase against you or by you completes the participle kept back by you, or as completing the main verb, or crying out against you. So what you see there is the English Standard Version. And you see the English Standard Version connects this prepositional phrase to crying out, connects it to the main verb. So it says, are crying out against you. Wages are crying out against you. The NASB puts it in front. The NASB connects it with the participle has been withheld. Notice also that the NASB does both. See, the against you is in italics, which means it's not there in the Greek. So what the NASB did, it was put it on both ends. So you could say, the pay of the laborers who mowed your fields and which has been withheld by you cries out, period. Or as the English Standard Version says, cries out or crying out against you. So that's the issue to look at here. And you see what the ESV does, and you can see what the NASB does. But here's a problem with the ESV. The idea of opposition, the idea of against you, this preposition, against you, is rare. It's rarely, if ever, translated or means against you. That's one of the big issues why the ESV is, you kind of raise your eyebrows and say, does that preposition ever mean against you? Probably not. Probably not. It's really rare if it's ever used at all. The preposition indicates the origin or source of the action. So that's why the NASB says withheld by you. By you, it indicates the source of the action. You are the one, you landowners, you are the one that's withholding it. Chapter 1 and verse 13 of James. You'll see this preposition again. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, indicating source. By God is the preposition. So there it's indicating the source or the origin of the action. And here in chapter 5 and verse 4 is probably doing the same thing. So what the NASB does is connect that. You are the source. It is you that are doing this. And then you simply has that pay that you have in your possession cries out because it's not in the right possession. It needs to be in the hands of your workers, not yourself. And so it's personified as crying out. That's what it is. So to try to understand why the NASB people put against you there, here's an explanation. The wage or the pay, and that's singular there. When it says, behold the wages, wages is singular. Behold the wage, behold the pay. When the pay or the wage is kept back by the greedy landowners, and it is because that wage is with the landowners, that the wage is personified as crying out from them. It's in their hands, they're landowners, it's in their hands. So it's crying out from them because it's in their location. But it's crying out against them functionally as well. So James pictures the wage sitting there in the bank and crying out to God because they have not been able, they have not been sent to those people whom they should have gone, to the laborers, and it's not there. So it's a functional translation, like they are crying out against you in the sense of a witness against the landowners. It's similar to the thought already expressed in verse 3. The personification of the defrauded wages crying out, it echoes the figure of Abel's blood, which was described as crying out to God. Remember when God confronted Cain and he said, the blood of your brother cries out to me. Remember that? It's the same kind of idea here. The verb crying out means shouting or screaming. In fact, in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 26, Matthew 9:26, here's an example. Here's another use of this word. It says, it's not. It's 15:23. My mistake. Matthew 15:23. This is the Syrophoenician woman. In verse 23, he did not answer her a word, and his disciples came and implored him, saying, send her away because she keeps shouting at us. That word shouting there is the word cries out. So we're not talking about a dripping faucet kind of thing here, where you can put up with it for a while, but then it just drives you absolutely out bonkers. We're talking about shouting and screaming. The money that's in the hands of the landowners is shouting and screaming. It echoes the crying out of the Israelites to God when they were in distress. You remember in the Old Testament, and Judges, especially in the time in the Judges, Israel would cry out to God, and God would be gracious and send a judge to deliver them. And then they would live in relative obedience for 40 years or so, and then the cycle would begin all over again. That some evil man would come along and subject them for a period of time, and then they would cry out again, and God would deliver them again. And that cycle went on for about 300 years. But that's what this crying out echoes. Israelites crying out to Yahweh. So that's the first accusation. The second accusation here, as he continues, he says, and the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. So the second accusation here, outcry, has reached the ears. The outcry, the noun, has reached the verb, and the object is the ears. And the word outcry there is the only time that we see, the only time that we have in the New Testament. The Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, has it 11 times. And in fact, an example of a couple of those in 1 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 14. You might remember this. I'm sure you do because we went through Samuel, remember, a couple years ago? Way back in 1 Samuel, I'm sure you remember this, right? Yeah. Chapter 4 and verse 14. Here is this word, outcry. When Eli heard the noise of the outcry, he said, what does the noise of this commotion mean? Then the men came hurriedly and told Eli. Well, the commotion came from the fact that Israel had lost the battle against the Philistines, and they had lost the ark as well. So people around the town were crying out, it says, the outcry of them. That's the word that we have in James chapter 5 in the latter part of verse 4. The outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears. So again, we're not talking about some laziness perhaps or workers that were not diligent. This is a breach of justice. This is a breach of what is right and good and specified in the Old Testament law, which makes a big difference with James because he's Jewish and of course he's writing to the 12 tribes that are scattered. And so as a principle of living, what is pleasing to God, this is valid. And the landowners have withheld. And so in the Old Testament language, the people are crying out here like you would have when there has been a great injustice done, like Israel lost the war and the ark was taken. There's other passages too. 1 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 16 is another passage. So this is what has taken place. There are a couple of places in the Old Testament, Isaiah chapter 5 and Isaiah chapter 22 and verse 14. And there are the only places where the figurative expression, the ears of the Lord of hosts, occurs. You see what he says here. The outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. The Lord of Sabaoth is a King James term. Now, that means Lord of hosts. Usually it's used in the King James. But the expression, the figurative expression, the ears of the Lord of hosts, we only see it 2 times in the Old Testament. Isaiah 5:9 and also Isaiah 22 and verse 14. And the context of Isaiah 5:9 is also about the oppression of the poor, and the context of Isaiah 24:14 describes the extravagant lives of the rich, both of which are echoed here in the language of James. So as James writes these things, he's drawing on his knowledge from the treatment of his people, his Jewish people, maybe perhaps by his own people in the past. Drawing from Isaiah, most of his readers, we would presume, would know this and would recognize these things. Very Jewish in his accusations here, very Jewish. The Lord of Sabaoth, as I mentioned, is a King James term. Usually you see that in that version. It's a term describing all of the forces that operate at God's command throughout the whole creation. Psalm 89 would be a passage to look to. Psalm 89 and verses 6 through 8. This is a wonderful statement. Psalm 89 verses 6 through 8. Listen to this. For who in the skies is comparable to the Lord? Who among the sons of the mighty is like the Lord? a God greatly feared in the council of the holy ones, and awesome above all those who are around him. O Lord God of hosts, there's your Lord of Sabaoth. O Lord God of hosts, who is like you, O mighty Lord? Your faithfulness also surrounds you. So that's a statement. That's this statement here describing everything at God's command throughout all of creation. So when he says these injustice has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth, the implication is it's reached the one who has the resources and has the knowledge to do something about it. This is not a small thing. Not at all. This Lord of Sabaoth or Lord of hosts is an old name for God. We see it in Jeremiah 10 and verse 16. And an old title for God who, in the role of a divine warrior, was the leader of the armies of Israel. In fact, another passage I'm sure you remember from 1 Samuel is in chapter 17. See, isn't it good that we went through 1 Samuel? You have all this background knowledge just like that, right at the fingertips. Chapter 17 of 1 Samuel in verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. You get the sense after that little statement by David that it's not going to go well for Goliath. It's Goliath against the Creator. And even though he's a big boy, he's not going to fare well, and he didn't. But that's what this Lord of Sabaoth means. That's all the thoughts that it would have conjured up in his readers. This is not a small matter. God is concerned about this. Don't play with fire. You need to treat your people well. To say that the cry of those reapers has entered the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth means, of course, that doom is imminent. Just as when David said it, doom was imminent for Goliath. For God to hear the cry of the poor is for him to bring judgment on their oppressors. In Psalm 18, in verse 6, you can look that up. Psalm 18, verse 6 is a statement. Also, Psalm 31 and verse 2. Incline your ear to me, rescue me quickly, be to me a rock of strength, a stronghold to save me. That's what they would cry out to be. That's what God is. He brings judgment on their oppressors, and that's what David was saying. Come to me, save me, strengthen me, deliver me. All of that is in verse 4. It's a huge statement. It doesn't look like much on the page there, verse 4, but there is a tremendous amount of Old Testament in the background of that helps us to understand the weightiness of what he says. You have to get into the Old Testament background. James is Jew, again, writing to Jews. But the second accusation, the second detail here is in verse 5. They followed a self-indulgent lifestyle. You have lived luxuriously on the earth and have led a life of wanton pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. The way he reads that, you just, oh boy. You fattened your hearts for the day of slaughter, and you get the sense that the day of slaughter is approaching. They have led this kind of life. James here lays out 5 consecutive here and running into verse 6. James lays out 5 consecutive clauses here, and each of them are anchored by a verb that indicates a statement of fact. And he delivers these, they come at us in a rapid style fashion or rapid fire fashion, these accusations against the rich defrauders. And the first one that we come to in verse 5 is the word, you have lived luxuriously. That's all one Greek word. You have lived luxuriously. It is what's called, in Greek, it's what's called an aorist. Aorist indicative, which simply means it's a statement of fact. It happened. It doesn't mean that it happened 10 years ago or one day ago. It just means it happened. You have lived luxuriously. A simple statement of fact. And the noun, this word here, is the noun is in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 13. And it's translated there in 2 Peter 2:13 as the word revel. Just a couple of pages over, chapter 2 and verse 13. Suffering wrong as the wages of doing wrong, they count it a pleasure to revel in the daytime. That's not a good description there. But that's the word you have lived of life of, or you have lived luxuriously. That same word is translated revel. And in Luke chapter 7 in verse 25, that noun is translated luxury. And the word means to lead a life of luxury or self-indulgence, as 2 Peter 2, revel, to carouse, is what the word means. It is used in the Shepherd of Hermas, or Hermes. You've heard the Shepherd of Hermas. It's a late second century document. It's used in that document meaning to be well fed, to live in luxury and to live luxuriously. That's what that word means there. So this is the accusation. You have done this. You have satisfied yourselves. There has been no want in your life. Whatever you desired, you did it. And he says, the second word, led a life of wanton pleasure. That also is one word. Led a life of wanton pleasure. And it's the same thing as the last word. It's an aorist indicative. Simple statement of fact. And this word here is only used right here in James 5 and in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 6. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 6 talks about widows, I believe. She who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even when she lives. Talking about who are widows, what qualifications do older women have to have in order to get onto the widow's list. So this word is used only here and in 1 Timothy 5. The word means to live luxuriously or voluptuously in indulgence. It's a different word. Obviously, there's some overlap there between the two words, but it is a completely different word. And the notion of wastefulness is in this word right here. The notion of wastefulness. This is precisely the lifestyle of the rich man in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Remember that in Luke chapter 16. Rich man and Lazarus, finally, they both died, and the rich man went to Hades, and Lazarus went to heaven. Remember that? And Abraham says, you had everything. You lived in style, and you did all these things while you were there, and now you're tormented, and now he is not tormented. But this word here describes the lifestyle of that rich man in Luke chapter 16. It's a lifestyle also condemned in other Jewish writings. Amos chapter 2, Amos chapter 8, Isaiah chapter 1, and verse 11 and following describes this lifestyle, and it is condemned by the writers in the Old Testament. So those are two of the words there. This rapid fire words, the clauses that he puts together. You have lived luxuriously. You have led a life of wanton pleasure. And the third word there, it's an aorist just like the others. Same thing, aorist indicative. You have fattened. You have fattened is also one word. James is just piling up stuff here. You have fattened, one word. In other words, indulging one's passions or inclinations. The word means to feed, nourish, support, or provide with food. And the phrase on earth means during your lifetime. While you lived, you did all of this. Quite an array of words. On earth, you have done all of these things on the earth during your lifetime. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. The day of slaughter here, what does that mean? When does that take place? The day of slaughter here may refer to a time when the poor suffer horribly while the rich are indulging themselves. In other words, it may be a day of slaughter for the poor people. However, the parallel to verse 3, remember the verse 3 talked about this rust will witness against you and consume your flesh like fire. It is the last days that you have stored up your treasure. So according to verse 3, it is the last days. And because it is the last days here, this day of slaughter, it strongly suggests a prophetic denunciation of a passage. In other words, it's looking forward to what's coming for them because it is the last days. The expression thus balances in the last days in verse 3. So you have in the last days, verse 3, and this statement right here, for the day of slaughter. They balance one another. And it tells us that we're not looking at something that's for the poor. We're looking at something that the wealthy landowners are going to get in the near future. These wealthy landowners, like well-fed oxen, were unconsciously fattening their own selves for the slaughter, while the cries of their victims ascended to heaven. They were living in luxury on earth, oblivious to the wrath to come. It is as if they volunteered to be fattened for slaughter. Amazing statement. The rich are represented as, one, sinning in getting their wealth by injustice. Nothing wrong with money, but getting their wealth by injustice. And two, and spending it merely on their own pleasures. And their folly is shown, one, in laying up their treasures on earth, and two, especially in doing so in the very day of judgment. Fattening themselves like sheep, unconscious of their own doom. A few commentators have suggested that the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 was the event to fulfill this coming day of slaughter. However, the epistle was written to the 12 tribes who are dispersed, not in Jerusalem. So did it affect any of them? Did the destruction of Jerusalem directly affect any of them if they were scattered abroad and not living in Jerusalem? Perhaps not. Chapter 5, verse 7. Therefore be patient until the coming of the Lord. Verse 7 places these events in the appearing of our Lord Messiah in His coming, not in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So it's interesting, I think it's interesting, that James would lay so much stress on the coming judgment, the imminent judgment that he knows is coming, and yet it has been this long since then. James expected that judgment to come. Clearly expected the judgment to come. And we'll flesh that out in the coming days as well. Last, verse 6. You have condemned and put to death the righteous man, and the righteous man there is the direct object, and he does not resist you. You have condemned. That's the fourth word, I believe it is. We have five. Remember, we had 5 words that James brings in there, just bam, 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 one right after another. Where the fourth one is here, you have condemned. That's also one word. And it's the same as all the others. It's an aorist indicative. It's a statement of fact. And the word, of course, means to condemn or find or pronounce guilty. And constantly found in a forensic or a legal sense as a sentence of condemnation given against someone for committing a crime. That's the way the word is used. In other words, they have done this. He says you have condemned either in some sort of court of law or you've acted as though you are the law. You have condemned and put to death the righteous man. But that condemn there is the fourth time we see this word, and put to death is the fifth one. Also, all of those are all the same thing, all aorist indicatives, all statements of fact. Put to death means murder or kill. It's the last of five of these words here. Now we have to ask a question. What does James mean when he says, you have killed the righteous man? Well, most likely he has in mind the practical outcome of the actions that the rich take against the poor to cheat them of their land and their wages. Did he mean literal murder here, literal killing here? Probably not. There is ways to explain it that do not mean literal murder, and we came across that a while back ago in James, and we gave an explanation there. It's probably not literal murder, but through whatever political maneuvers or power grab maneuvers, whatever it may be, they have rendered the workers in such a way that someone would look at them and say, you killed them. And they might say, no, I haven't killed. Yes, you have, because the way you're doing things, it's a slow death. They're going to die. You're not paying them. They're going to starve eventually if you keep up doing what you're doing. You've killed them. It's that sense. So sometimes commentators call this a judicial murder. Understood from the previous verb condemn, that is, by perverting the law, the rich condemn the helpless poor to death, primarily by taking away their means of making a living. It can also happen that the courts deprive the poor of their livelihood by confiscating their farms or other means of support. I think it's next to impossible to know what's going on, what's taking place here, why are they doing what they're doing. Obviously, they're landowners, people in power, whether politically or owning something, and the people who do not have that kind of influence are being used by those who do have the influence, who do have the power. Of course, the world grabs onto that, and we have what's called liberation theology. We've talked about that a little bit. It's called liberation theology. Means they use James at times to say, if you're rich, you're in sin. You have to not be rich in order to be saved, and you have to give away all your money and all these other kind of things. But that's not what James is talking about here. Not at all. Not even close. So he finishes this out saying, you have condemned and put to death the righteous man. So we ask, who is the righteous man? And many commentators say it's Messiah that he's talking about. He's Messiah. The righteous one was a title of Jesus by the apostles and by Peter as well. Acts 3:14, Stephen in Acts 7, Paul in Acts 22. They referred to Jesus as the righteous one. So when James says it here, it's a possibility. But I think in the final analysis, this term, the righteous one, is best regarded as a generic collective term, not defined or confined by one individual, but the righteous one, whoever that might be, and how many ever there might be, it's these people. You've put to death the righteous one, the righteous man. I think that's the better understanding here. So the words are applicable to even James himself. He was known in his day to all the Jews as James the Just. And then he says, he does not resist you. That's an interesting. He does not resist you. Now, of all of those aorist verbs, right, simple statements of fact, this is a present indicative verb. So this, he says here, this is what you've done. You've done this and this and this and this, and currently he does not resist you. That's the effect. It's a present indicative verb. Fact, it's indicative, so it's true, and it's present, it's going on. He does not resist you. He's not resisting you. He does not put up a fight. So two questions. Is that clause there a statement, or is it a question? And who is the subject? Who is the one who is not resisting? Now, this is another grammatical and hermeneutical challenge that we have in James. And I believe the correct answer is that this is a statement. It's not a question, just like it has, you see it there in the New American Standard. It's a statement, and the subject here is the collective righteous sufferers. He does not, they do not, they do not resist you. So I think the evidence, I really, after studying this, looking at this, I think it's very clear that this is a statement here. And this person, the righteous man here, this collective people that are not resisting you. So James is not saying at all that they are responding to this in an unwise or unbiblical manner. These people do not resist what you're doing to them. And so he turns back in verse 7 to those people that are being mistreated by the landowners. He says to them, therefore be patient until the coming of the Lord. Remember, they do not have a representative government in that day like we do. It's a blessing to have a representative government because now you can participate. You can participate in anything from school board to President of the United States. It's a representative government. In this day, they could not. James' instruction here is to be patient, wait until the coming of the Lord. His instruction today would still be patient to us. Be patient, wait until the coming of the Lord. He's not saying to us practically, don't vote, don't do anything about it. Of course, don't do anything unbiblical about it. But understand that this is the way of the world, as we talked about this morning. Sometimes it's going to be good, sometimes it's not going to be good. That's the times that we live in. But the instruction to them is to be patient, wait until the coming of the Lord. You know, in the end, truth will be vindicated. That's exactly what he says in verse 7. In the end, it will be vindicated. It's not to say you should lay down and become a welcome mat for everybody. He's not saying that by any means. So the evidence, I think, is very clear here. They are condemned, these landowners, the rich here, are condemned not simply for their wealth. Never says that at all. They are condemned for their sinful use of wealth. For whatever influence and power they have, they are mistreating others and using it to mistreat others. And that's why James comes down on them like thunder. Verse 5, come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. It's a blessing to have money. You can be a blessing to others. But in this case, people were not doing that. When you have resources, you're not a draw, you're not a drain for others. That's why in 1 Timothy chapter 5, who are the widows? The first responsibility for a widow is her family. And when there's no family, then it falls upon the church's responsibility. So while some Christians have not heeded this strong call for social justice, many services like hospitals and social service ministries were founded under Christian impulse, Christian motivations, Christian desires. They knew the right thing to do was to help people, and so they did these things. The foreign missionary has often been maligned, but manifold numbers of schools and hospitals have been founded through such missions. The social gospel movement of the early 20th century did at times neglect the spiritual aspect of salvation. And its theological optimism, of course, died out in the sufferings of 2 world wars. Those would be the post-millennial people. It is unfortunate, however, as one commentator writes here, that some evangelicals today see any expression of concern for social justice as a revival of the feared social gospel. James would be perplexed at such fears. The opportunities for practicing pure and undefiled religion, James 1:27, should be multiplied rather than diminished through fear of abuse. Gospel work and social work are not to be separated, bifurcated, separated. They go hand in hand without competition. And I would agree with him, with the caveat that never forget that the first mission and the first purpose of the church is to sow the seeds of the Word of God. But that doesn't mean you can't help people along the way. It's not an either-or kind of deal. Well, James, boy, he had a lot to say in these first 6 verses to these people. And so next week in verse 7, he's going to turn specifically to those that are being trampled on, so to speak, and he's going to give them some instruction. And it's not going to be long here before we're completed the book of James. Any questions about this? Okay. Well, let's thank you for your participation tonight. It's a blessing to see all of you here. Again, when there may be a short series or two or a sermon or two or something before we jump into 1 John, but 1 John will be the next book. I'm looking forward to that. Let's close in a word of prayer. Give it about 5 or 10 minutes or so, and then we'll gather for a prayer time here. Our gracious God, we thank you for the clear instruction you give us in your word. We thank you for the Spirit of God who dwells in us. It gives understanding. It enables us to believe, enables us to comprehend, enables us to live the truth. We thank you, Father, that you are so sufficient in all regards to our salvation. From the calling, from the drawing, and from the effectual calling all the way to the glorification, Lord, you have supplied it all. You've provided for it all. You've already done all of these things. And you call us to do one thing, to be faithful. So we ask, God, that as your children, strengthen us to be faithful so that we may please you, our Father, in all that we do. We thank you, God, for the joy of worship. And we ask for our leaders of this country. We ask that you would bless them with eternal life, that you would cause them to understand their sinfulness and their need to believe, to escape the condemnation that awaits them. We ask, God, that you would save them, that you would grant them life, that you would send revival through D.C. What a joy that would be. We ask, God, that you would be pleased to protect the freedoms and preserve the freedoms that you have granted to us. We are so thankful, Father. We are so blessed. We ask that you would be pleased to keep those freedoms intact. But also we ask that you would awaken the Church of Jesus Christ, that you would cause us to be active, cause us to understand the days in which we live. Do not let us be lazy. Do not let us be lethargical about all of these blessings that we have, and just presume that they'll be here tomorrow or the next day. We know, Father, you do not promise that. So, Lord, help us to live each day faithfully for your glory, so that your name would be exalted. We ask for your strength to be faithful each day. Strengthen us, Father. Glorify your name in your people, we ask. These things, all of these things, we ask in your Son's name, Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you. And if you're going tomorrow to